All right, everyone, let's get started. Thank you for joining us again for our second virtual learning session, Supercharge Your Campaign with Creative Action, led by Janelle Treibitz. We'll have some former fellows on the line. So I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is Janelle Treibitz, and I'm the Training and Communications Associate at the Opportunity Agenda, and I will be moderating. Please feel free to enter any questions in real time, and we'll get to them at the end. A survey will also appear at the end, so please take a minute to complete that. We'll also send a copy of the recording via the follow-up email afterwards. And just to give you an idea of who we're expecting today, we have Sunu Chandy from the National Women's Law Center, Marisa Limon from the Hope Border Institute, Emily Chatterjee from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, David Trujillo from the ACLU of San Diego, Cynthia Pompa from the ACLU of Texas, Kristen Marston from Color of Change, Troy Rienstra from Safe and Just Michigan, and Elaine Gregg from Indivisible Tohono. So they'll be joining us at some point in the session, so just keep that in mind, and especially if you have any questions for any of them or us at the end. And with that, I will hand it over to Janelle.
Thank you, Suhey. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for this virtual learning session. As Suhey mentioned, I'm Janelle Treibitz, the Creative Strategies Coordinator. I have met some of you in person, which is always lovely. I am going to be talking about designing creative actions today. And so I wanted to start out by just a quick logistical note, which is I'll be taking questions at the end. And so you have a little control panel for your GoToWebinar, and feel free at any time during the presentation to just throw questions in there, and we'll look at them and answer them, as many as we can at the end. So let's get started. I want to begin by making sure we're all thinking about what creative action is in the same way. So when I say the word action, I'm really referring to campaign tactics that you use to try to build support to win your goals. So that could include lobby visits, petitions, marches, press conferences, issue briefings, call-in days, picket lines, things like that. These are things that most of us are probably pretty familiar with. And so the question then is, why would we use creative actions? These actions in many ways do work, but what does creativity get you? And first of all, I will say that creative actions, when you are organizing and designing them in the right way, are incredible drivers of narrative. It really allows you to tell the story that you're trying to tell and pushes the specific message that you have for your action. It also generates media attention. Media like things that are unexpected or that are unusual, and adding some creative elements to your actions, or framing your action in a totally new way that folks aren't used to, can really help push your story to the top. Also, creativity and cultural skills are an opportunity to develop creative leadership. There are probably many people on staffs of your organizations, in your base, people in your network who have skills or come from particular experiences where there's a lot of cultural, I use the term assets. There are many cultural assets that you can be drawing upon just within the networks you already have for different kinds of actions that'll spice it up a little bit or help reframe what you're trying to do. Also, culture builds relationships, art builds relationships. It's an opportunity to bring more of yourself into a space. It's an invitation for folks to bring more of themselves into a space, and it reinforces a healthy movement culture, saying that yes, we see you. There are more things than just showing up and chanting. We can be singing together. We can be creating food together. And culture and actions that are designed to bring that out really allow for that. And finally, it's fun and it invites joy. And I would argue that right now we need a lot more of that. So next, let's look at the building blocks of creative action. There are three essential elements if you're going to be designing an action that both is uplifting creativity, but also deeply strategic. So first, you want to try and center your narrative. Second, you want to use the creative assets that you have. And third, you want to know your audience. So first, we're going to dive into centering narrative and how we can do that. I created a little analysis metaphor that is built on the research and analysis of our own director of research, Lucio Turley. I find trees a really useful metaphor, oft used in different movement spaces. And so basically, this is to express that you can think of narrative as having three different levels to it. So on like the very surface level, it's you can think about the conversation that emerges in the wake of something that happens in the world or in your community. And that we call a developing story. And underneath the developing story are the dominant narratives at play that lead to support or whatever support or opposition to that developing story. And underneath that is the root cause that shapes what the prevailing attitudes and beliefs are, what the dominant narratives are, because they're stemming from some basic root causes. And those are the three layers. And when we think of creative actions and how to design actions, we can think about making a choice about what we want the action to be addressing. Do we want it to be addressing the story and the conversation that's happening in the moment, or do we want it to try and design it to be actually shining a light on the root cause? We're going to look at one example to just plug it into this entry points analysis. So for example, recently the border is closed to asylum seekers. There's a SCOTUS, a Supreme Court decision upholding the level of that. And so that is about developing story, and there are conversations both opposing and supporting that came out in the wake of it. For thinking about our opposition, and if we wanted to organize an action that was thinking about all the ecosystem around that particular debate, we could look at then the prevailing attitudes and beliefs that lead people to support closing the border. So one of those prevailing beliefs, obviously, are that immigrants are criminals. That's been a drum that is beaten regularly these days. Then also law and order equals safety, and the assumption that if we just uphold and enforce laws, therefore our communities will be safe, which many of us, of course, realize is not the case. And if we look deeper, we'll find the root causes are really based in white supremacy. For a lot of these folks, the idea that white people need to be in vast dominance, particularly with a lot of like demographic fear that is based on xenophobia. So that's just a quick analysis. And I want to go through three quick examples of folks who designed their action with each of these different entry points in mind. So you could think about, I want to respond to this thing. How do I want to do it? And these are examples on three very different issues on how people decided to go about creating actions. So the first one is Barbecue Becky. And I imagine that a lot of you recognize this meme. Basically, Barbecue Becky is an internet nickname for a woman who called the police on a group of Black folks who were just having a barbecue in a park. And it is so representative of a very common experience that it became viral, inspired a lot of public outrage, and she was dubbed Barbecue Becky. And this was not, the campaign I'm going to talk about was actually not a unified campaign by like an organization. It was actually individuals who were outraged by the situation decided to be creative about how they wanted to respond. And so we see that there are memes that developed. Here's one of them. Barbecue Becky is in the foreground. And in the background, you see Martin Luther King Jr. giving one of his famous speeches. And Barbecue Becky is calling him into the police in this meme. Another meme that came about is Barbecue Becky calling the police on Barack Obama. Another one is Barbecue Becky calling in Rosa Parks. And we also have things in like the world of science fiction, Barbecue Becky calling in the world of Wakanda and the gathering in Wakanda. And so this was a very funny, viral creative action, though it was not organized in a singular way. But I want to use it as an example, particularly because it both responds to a developing story in a really effective way that also grounds it in the systemic nature of what happened. And so I think just by the fact that Barbecue Becky is placed in so many different contexts, it helps underscore the systemic and pervasive nature of racism and the criminalization of Black people. And you could, because of that, you could say that this is a great example of an action that really straddles both the developing story and also the prevailing attitudes and beliefs. It does actually both of those things in one. Next, we're going to look at the People's Paper Co-op. This is a group in Philadelphia, a group of artists and formerly incarcerated individuals who formed a collective. And they partnered with an expungement clinic, which is the place where returning citizens go in order to clear their criminal records, have their records expunged. And they decided that they really wanted to change perceptions about returning citizens. So they worked with the folks coming into the clinic to create new paper out of their old paper criminal records. They like put it in water. I don't know if any of you made paper before, but they put it in water, like it all comes to bits. And then you like dry it and do things that I don't fully know how to make paper, but you can take old pieces of paper and make it into new paper that's like clear without any words on it or anything. And then they would have the folks coming into the clinic, they'd be part of this process of like remaking their criminal records. And then on this blank paper that they created, they would answer the question, when people look at your criminal record, what don't they see about you? You can see examples of this in the picture there. And they ended up creating kind of like a big quilt that they would take for lobbying days. They used it as a very powerful advocacy tool that both humanized folks and also showed what they're struggling with and also what they could become. And it was very effective for the folks who were then advocating on different policies. Next, we're going to look at the campaign to take down memorials to white supremacy. These examples were a campaign by Take 'Em Down NOLA and BYP 100. Color of Change has also done a lot of work around this. And I think the thing I want to point out is that these folks, in order to address root causes, they decided to target the symbols of the root cause as an effective way to shine a light on the root cause, on white supremacy. And you'll find that when you get into looking at root causes and trying to address root causes, it often, because it's often hidden, you're looking for something on the surface. Another example is Change the Mascot, which is the campaign to change mascot names on sports teams away from racist slurs, particularly racist slurs that often are insulting and targeting Native American tribes. And so that, focusing on a campaign like that or an action that's calling out that allows you to have a deeper conversation about the root cause. And that's one way you get to it. Next, we're going to look at the second building block, which is using your creative assets. And for this, you can make yourself a little map and map your network of people that you have access to. For under artists, you may not have Beyonce, but you may have access to some kind of creative influencer, an artist, but it doesn't matter if you do, because if you really think about how power works, how influence works, sometimes like the folks who are singing in your local community, like a local band, has actually far more influence over the folks you're trying to reach than a Beyonce necessarily would. Also, sometimes artists don't need to be even influencers in any right. Sometimes just having somebody who knows how to write a poem or work a puppet is a really great resource to be able to think differently about the kind of things you can access for different actions and for you to decide like what resources do I have access to if I want to try to make something a little more creative. Call on the artists in your community. I will say artists, especially folks who've been doing art for a while, are used to using a different part of their brain than folks who are solely focused on advocacy or other elements of organizing. And they can often come up with ideas that are outside of what we're used to thinking about. And so I always recommend bring artists in early, have them at the table as you're thinking about strategy and as you're thinking about designing an action, and also pay them. So an artist, particularly an artist with a skill set, a specific skill set who's been developing that skill set, should be thought of just like you think of somebody who's like a web designer. You would not probably be asking a web designer to be doing your new website for free, and neither should you think about asking a skilled artist to be making art for you for free. You should try and figure out how you can pay them. So I will just put that plug in there. Next, we're going to think about symbols. So there are a lot of symbols out in the zeitgeist that can be drawn upon. I have the example here of Colin Kaepernick's taking a knee. That's been a very powerful symbol that's taken a lot of life in different contexts far outside of the sports arena where he created it. And we can think of symbols from the past, symbols from the future. We can also create our own new symbols that we popularize within our own movement spaces that might have a wider life even outside of that. But symbols are a really useful way to make a quick connection to a broader idea. And then we think about pop culture. Pop culture is really useful because it's a way for us to utilize storylines, characters, also symbols that have wide understanding in our culture. So like the example here is the Wakanda Forever symbol popularized by the Black Panther movie. The Black Panther storyline and concept, the Star Wars, all of these have recognizable fights against evil, fights for justice, concepts that you can repurpose for your own use in order to make something a little bit more fun and also access kind of this larger narrative that sometimes is harder to get through your own issue. If you connect it to, people will understand the narrative behind or underlying, like a pop culture storyline, very quickly, and that's really useful for us to know and to think about using in how we design actions. Also, current fads and memes are super useful. I chose a picture here of the Sharpie Gate, which probably most of you are aware of, where Trump tried to justify a mistake he made, a tweeted mistake about how Alabama was going to get hit by Hurricane Dorian, which it was not in the past. And so they had a subsequent, I don't know, like a press conference or something, where he came out and somebody drew a Sharpie line to extend the path of Hurricane Dorian in order to justify Trump's mistake. And so Sharpie Gate has been, and as many memes, it's been a shortcut to be able to imply something outlandish that's absolutely not true, like unreasonable justification. And that's what memes can do, is they can also, there's shortcuts for a larger story that you can very quickly get to by sort of building on it. And so, you know, with Sharpie Gate, there's been a lot of funny digital memes that have come out in the way of Barbecue Becky, where it's like making fun of Trump, but particularly because it's in the zeitgeist now, because it got so far, because people are playing up on it. You could use that in a different way if you have a legislator who's like justifying something that's unjustifiable or something like that. Also, like other trends, you can think about other trends. You can even go with fashion trends. Anything that's you know, in the zeitgeist. I'm using that term a lot, probably. But anything that's out there in the world that you think people would recognize, that would help you to tell your story and make your point. And last, I'll touch on holidays and shared cultural events. And this is a super useful shared cultural touchstone to build upon. A great example is the Mama's Day bailout. So working on Mother's Day, which helps just by choosing Mother's Day, it helps automatically to humanize folks, women, particularly who are in prison, and it allows you to talk about cash bail, all in the context of this larger Mother's Day that everybody shares and everybody recognizes. And so you can think about building upon a holiday like that. You can also think about taking a twist on a holiday and creating your own holiday to make a point. You can also think about challenging a holiday in order to have a deeper conversation about the history or about things that need to change. Great. Next, we're going to talk about the third building block, which is know your audience. And I'm not going to spend too long on this, but the very basic context is that your target audience may not necessarily be the target decision maker for your campaign. So if you're doing an action, your target audience is who you're trying to influence for that particular action. So if you're trying to put pressure on a decision maker, the way to think of your audience for a particular action is who it's like you're basically like your secondary target. Like you want to maybe draw up public outrage. And so you're trying to design an action that's going to get public attention, or maybe a specific community's attention. In which case that's who your target audience is. So when thinking then about your target audience for a particular action, think about how you would frame it in a way that's accessible to them and would be resonant. And think about the tone that would be necessary. Sometimes folks are really open about like angry tones that like actually really resonates with particular communities in a moment, or with media honestly love outrage. But also sometimes maybe you're trying to really put yourself as a protagonist in a way that you're getting people who are more persuadable, in which case you might want to use a more positive oriented tone. Also, messengers are really important. It's great if you can frame yourself as a sympathetic messenger. It's also great if you want to like work with businesses are great messengers for some kinds of things, or certain artists can be great messengers, or, you know, sectors of the population like mothers, very sympathetic messengers. So thinking about the messages for your particular action can also help think differently about it. Next, we're going to just touch on several creative action design tips. First tip number 1, don't counter reframe. And before I go too far into this, I want to say that you don't necessarily need to think of using these tips for every single action. These tips provide a little bit of a framework to help you dive deeper into sort of best practices and ways to think about designing actions. So tip number 1, don't counter reframe. Very, very basically, you all have heard our mantra of like, don't myth bust. And this is an extension of that. If you design an action where you're in many ways elevating the story or the argument that you're actually trying to fight against, you might not be doing yourself a favor. Instead, if you reframe or design an action that instead is putting forth the story that you want to tell and the framing that you want to use, that could be much more effective. This first example that you see here, an image of, is a Montana Human Rights Network who came into custody of 4,000 white supremacist Bibles, which is filled with like hate speech and books promoting extreme anti-Semitic, racist ideologies. And they knew that this would be an attractive story for the media, and it would be a way to be able to talk about both their work and talk about things that people could do to counter hate. But they didn't want to just uplift the books themselves, because then it was uplifting them as like some kind of iconography. So what they decided to do was commission artists and partner with a museum in order to turn the books into pieces of art. So they invited them to integrate the books or transform them or pages of the books in provocative ways. And so 60 artists participated. It resulted in an exhibition that ended up having a wide national life and touring around the country. The exhibition was called Speaking Volumes, Transforming Hate. And it really did an amazing job at broadening the conversation and making that opportunity of having all those books be what they needed it to be. Next, we're going to look at tip 2, create the future you want to see. And I feel like it's important, especially in an era where fear-based narratives are used so powerfully, to make the future that we want to build feel tangible and desirable. And you can use actions as an opportunity to embody the future that we want, which I will say, from experience, really lights up people's imagination and helps them broaden what they understand to even be possible. And so this example that you see in this picture happened in Austria when the government bailed out a failing bank for 19 billion euros. There was not a lot of public outrage in that incident. And so to protest the bailout and help Austrians understand the enormity of that number, a group of architecture students designed and created a scale model of a city that could be built for the same price tag as the bailout. They called their fake city Hypotopia, which was like a play on the name of the bank. And they built it and put it out on the square in the capital, one of the main squares in the capital. And then they would do daily tours. And this city was like the city that you would dream to create. It centered public good, it centered justice and people, it centered green economies. And so they would like take folks out and point out the co-ops and point out like the collective healthcare institutions and things like that. And 40,000 people came and visited this fake city. If it had been a real city, it would have been the 6th largest city in Austria and made a real strong point about both reframing the government's argument for why they needed bailout and helping people understand really really the loss it was for the government to be prioritizing institutions. And Hypotopia incidentally became the runner-up for Word of the Year in Austria that year. Next, we're going to look at tip number 3, which is set up win-win situations. And so this is the basic idea that no matter what your opposition does, you set up a situation where you come out with some kind of a win. The best example from recent days that I've heard is this group called Pop Mob, based in Portland. They formed in response to the fact that all these white nationalist groups, particularly the Proud Boys, were starting to rally regularly in Portland to draw media attention, to try to recruit, and try to like bring their issues to the top of like public attention. And at a particularly large planned gathering by the Proud Boys, they decided to do a fundraiser based on the number of Proud Boys who showed up. So they had people pledge money, a certain number of dollars for every Proud Boy who participated in the rally, and all the funds raised went to a nonprofit that supports immigrant families, Causa, Oregon. And so then they were able to play with that, and then in the lead up, they were also able to like, thank you, Proud Boys, for helping us support immigrant families and things like that were like completely against what the Proud Boys stood for. And so, the Proud Boys did rally, which, so they didn't stop it from rallying, but they were able to raise $36,000 for the nonprofit. So again, it's a win-win situation. Raising the money is awesome. Also, Proud Boys canceling would have been awesome. Either way, they come out on top. Next example is for tip number 4. Make your action your message. Another way to say this is show, don't tell. So a lot of times, if folks are showing up to your action and if they have to read your press release or talk to somebody to understand what your story is, then that's not going to be your best case scenario. What you want is for somebody to show up to your action and know instantly where you stand and pretty much what your message is, and get an inkling of what the overall narrative is. And creative actions are very good for this. And one example, which you'll see in the picture, happened when Republicans, this was years ago, but it's an oldie but goodie. Years ago, Republicans in Massachusetts were trying to do a massive tax cut package. And they decided to make their point. They were going to restage the Boston Tea Party, which, if you remember, was like a colonial era protest, problematic in so many ways that I won't get into, but that where they threw tea overboard of ships in the Boston Harbor in order to protest taxation without representation. So in this version of it, Republicans decided that they were going to have, you can see on that boat there, Republicans surrounding this big trunk of supposed tea, and they were going to do it because their whole argument for their tax cut was that it would help middle-class families. So the day before this action, United for a Fair Economy found out that it was going to happen, and they decided to interrupt it. And now, just to set the scene a little bit, you can see there's the boat there. Across, right across from that boat is a big platform set up with tons of reporters on it. You got TV and print media all taking pictures and filming. And so the Republicans are on there. They're ready to throw this thing over. And United for a Fair Economy had rented a little boat, had dressed up in like little working man clothes with like hard hats and stuff, and had one simple sign that said "Working Family Life Raft." And they paddled themselves in the way of the Republicans who were about to throw the tea overboard. Now, the Republicans, as you might imagine, were very confused about what to do, except that the United for a Fair Economy had actually planted infiltrators on the boat in suits, who then at that moment started shouting, "Dump it in, dump it in." And so the Republicans, not knowing what else to do, dumped it in, capsized the life raft. And then there was a heyday. So that was like a perfect example. The working family capsized life raft, capsized by the taxes that the Republicans were supposedly going to do. So it was an amazing example of how you can show and not tell. And it completely changed the narrative in that moment of what those taxes were going to do. Tip 5 is to build your movement culture through your action. And so this is an encouragement to think of your actions as a way to develop a culture that demonstrates your value. In actions, you can use rituals. You can figure out how to be welcoming to new folks. You can center what you're fighting for, not just what you're fighting against. And building your movement culture into an action is about modeling how you want to be in relationship to each other, about making room for people's cultural heritage and thinking of cultural and creative skills as leadership skills. This particular image is from the Black Joy Parade in Oakland, which, though not necessarily attached to a campaign, is in many ways an action that is getting at the heart of root cause and rejecting that. And instead of saying we're going to make this about that, we're gonna just be together. And so it's a pretty subversive action, not necessarily attached to a specific campaign or policy shift, but that allows people to be represented in the way that they want to be represented and have a space that's not about what the rest of society puts on them. So let's go back to our original little PowerPoint page, looking at the traditional actions that we are very familiar with. So making actions creative doesn't have to be as elaborate as some of the case studies that I shared. It can be as simple as thinking more creatively about some of the traditional tactics that you have coming up. So how can you center your narrative? How can you use your creative assets? And how do you design an action appropriate for your target audience? Maybe a march could become a parade. Maybe a picket line could become a sidewalk dance-off. Maybe a town hall could become a community celebration and dinner. Maybe you could have a rally that's also a talent show. Maybe you could turn a petition into a mobile mural where people are having artists draw the vision that they want to see and not just focused around their signatures. Maybe a community info session would become a block party. There are a lot of different options for how we can think about changing the traditional things that we already have planned and adding an element that would make it a lot more fun and exciting, more newsworthy, and also a situation that both welcomes new folks, develops your own internal culture, and really drives home the ultimate narrative that you're trying to express. So that is what I've got, y'all. So just a little reminder to write your questions into a little control panel if you have questions. And I'm going to turn it back over to Suhei, who I think is going to moderate the question answer session.
Thank you, Janelle. And we will give you a minute to send any questions you have for Janelle. Questions or comments, I should say. All right, well, if you think of anything else, you can contact me, Suhey at sramirez@opportunityagenda.org, and I believe Janelle also provided some of her contact information at the beginning.
Yes, I did.
Right.
And also, I should have mentioned, you all should think of me as a resource if you are trying to plan an action and you want to try and make it a little bit different, or think about how you want to center a narrative in it. I am always game to talk through that.
And actually, before we go, Janelle, I have here, can you elaborate on any cultural strategies that we're seeing today and how those may be helpful or harmful?
Sure. So, I mean, if we're talking about cultural strategies a little bit more big picture, I think there's a lot of different, there's a lot of energy being put towards cultural influencers and Hollywood, which is a really important part of this ecosystem, but not the only part of a cultural ecosystem. So when you're talking about cultural strategies, we're talking about how are you also trying to not just shift policy, but you're also trying to shift culture and some of those underlying values and assumptions that people believe so strongly in, which people often learn through culture. And so some of the current strategies I'm seeing are folks focusing on representation in Hollywood and some of like the storylines, trying to get more authentic storylines being written, trying to get folks into writers' rooms who are more diverse and represent a broader swath of society other than just white folks. We also have strategies that are about getting influencers to speak out on different issues, and all of that has been very important. But the other thing that I think that research has also shown is that folks possibly choose, the causation is not necessarily proven, but there's a correlation between what folks watch and what their political views are, which also means that sometimes even if great stories are being told, which is important and should always happen, but it's not necessarily reaching all of the audiences that you want to reach. And so I think that there are many other, my personal opinion is that everything starts from the ground up. Everything starts from movements and people organizing. And so the symbols and the storylines and the concepts that make their way up into the world of influencers in Hollywood start within movements. And so part of the most essential and in many ways, I think, underfunded and underfocused on aspect of cultural strategies is getting movements to really define their vision of the future, having them develop their own rituals, their own cultural practices and symbols that then will, as the movements popularize, as those things, as they resonate, will move up the ladder of influence to a broader and broader audience. So I think that's one of the essential areas that I think as movement people that we need to be focusing on, and which is why I think like starting with creative actions and starting with developing who are the artists, who are the cultural folks you have access to, what are the aspects about our own cultural heritages that we bring with us into movement work that we could actually be drawing upon to really embody the world we want to live in and build a cultural practice through actions and through our own internal movement cultures that help us demonstrate that and offer models for other folks to do the same.
Thank you, Janelle. And someone said, these are great suggestions. Thanks for bringing them alive with pics and stories. All right, and unless you have anything else, Janelle?
No, thanks. So other than a reminder to fill out the evaluation at the end, everybody. Please do that. Really helps us improve our webinars.
Yes, thank you. And again, we'll be providing a recording of the session via email, so look out for that as well. Thanks a lot. Have a good day.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.